Right. Okay. Thank you for coming along today. Thank you for bearing with me on the technology. If you don't know me, I'm John O'Shea, I'm head of English. I'm going to talk to you about the Merchant's Tale, and I'm hoping to go from the beginning up to about the time of the wedding. Now, I know some of you might not have even got to the wedding stage yet. Your class might be concentrating on the contexts, and so you've gone slower through the text, and that's perfectly fine. Different classes will go at a different pace, but our shared resources mean that we will all do everything, and you will have access to everything, but you just might do it at slightly different times. I'm going to try and keep the chat on. If you have a question, every, say, 5-10 minutes, I might stop and just take some questions from you, try and make it interactive if you do. Should have the text to hand, if you've got it. And I'll begin. Let me see if I can show conversation. Okay, I'll keep the questions. Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to start with looking at the language first of all. Now, language isn't, AA2 isn't a big assessment objective for this one, but it does allow us to sort of make comparisons across your two texts when you look at the Duchess of Malfi. So I'm going to talk broadly about the Merchant's Tale and how you can refer to it. And then I'm going to look at the text sections by sections, if that's okay with you. Okay? If you have any questions along the way, type them in and I'll try and answer them at designated points. Right. First of all, this is your poetry text, okay? And so it's in verse. In fact, it's in rhyming couplets in iambic pentameter, a little bit like Shakespeare's verse, except every line, every 2 lines rhyme. Why is that important, perhaps? Is that certain words get foregrounded in rhyme, and perhaps rhyme also mimics the storytelling spoken element of it that makes it memorable. Chaucer, you have to remember, is writing in an ironic persona of the merchant. So Chaucer does this in all of his various stories. He takes on the character, so he's adopting a persona. So sometimes in the text, you might see reference, it might be Chaucer talking, but more often than not, he's adopted the ironic persona of the merchant throughout the story. I'm going to talk about irony a little bit, because I think it's something that you do need to sort of address in the tale. Whenever you talk about Chaucer and going into an exam, always try to remember, I must talk about irony with Chaucer, okay? The tale is a verse narrative. That means purely it's a poem that tells a story. So what is characteristic about the prologue and the tale that you should know? So I'm sure you've covered this in class, but let's talk about irony a little bit. The really good students will see how both the Duchess of Malfi as a tragedy uses irony and how the Merchant's Tale uses irony. First of all, irony will be in the descriptions by the merchant. So he will talk about January, the worthy knight, the worthy knight. But the readers and the audience know that this knight is not worthy at all. Equally, fresh May is described being virginal, but we also know that she's actually been with Damien at some stage. So irony is where somebody says something, but there's an alternative intended meaning. We're going to look at irony whenever references are made to marriage or wives, okay, in this tale. And also where the merchant talks about biblical auctorities. You see that word there. Can you see the screen, by the way? Can you see the PowerPoint that I'm talking about? If one of you could just type yes or no. That. Okay, good. Right. Thank you. In Chaucer's time, when they wanted to make an argument, they would use auctorities or authorities. So they would make reference to what other people have said before them. Now, you're going to see lots of biblical authorities or auctorities where somebody has made, where the merchant is making reference to something in the Bible, but often that will be used ironically. You don't need to know every single story in the Bible. You just need to know how irony is going to be used. So I'll be talking about that a little later. Forgive me if I go fast. The tale itself, which you haven't yet studied, uses the form of courtly love. And you'll cover that with your teachers. But it isn't really a courtly love story. It's more of a dirty story. And so the form of using a literary genre, courtly love, is used ironically. The other thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of irony is irony of self. And this is really in terms of how January talks about himself prior to the wedding. Okay, January still thinks he's a stud, he's a lover, he's a virulent, energetic man. But he's 60 if he's a day, and there is a gap between how he sees himself and how the readers and this fictitious audience would view him. And this is the way that comedy often works in Britain. In sitcoms, we often find humor with the difference between how an individual sees themselves and how we see them. An example of that might be, say, David Brent in The Office, who thinks he's really cool, but the audience are kind of laughing at him. So irony works in terms of what is said about people, but also in their presentation. There's also ironic presentations in the description of the marriage, and we'll try and come to that later on. Any description that in any way references the Garden of Eden story is being done ironically. Because the audience would be familiar with the Garden of Eden story and the temptation of Eve by the devil, they are constantly being reminded of the impending temptation of Eve. So any reference to serpents or gardens or heaven on earth or paradise is ironic because it's deliberately intended to remind us of the story of temptation of Eve in the Bible story. Are there any questions before I move on from irony? You can write them down and I'll come back to them. There is irony in the symbolism given to the names of characters and also the animal imagery used to describe characters. And so January being winter and May being spring would be examples of that. And so they're not just names conjured up, but they have an ironic meaning. They're meant to symbolize the disparity between these two characters. In terms of the language, my tip to you on how to understand this text is not to try and understand every single line or every single word, okay? This is, from the 1300s. It's a 14th century text. That's 7 centuries ago. Try to understand the gist of every paragraph, okay? Paragraphs are a good way of dividing up your study of the text because they will usually highlight a change in subject matter. So if you can get the gist of a paragraph, you're doing really well. Don't get hung up about understanding every single line. And you're still at the early stages of this. So if you're finding it a bit of a challenge at the moment, that's okay. It will get a lot easier. The Merchant's Prologue is told with the idea, ironically, that someone's telling us a story. So we sometimes get digressions in which they go off tangent. We sometimes get the narrator adopt the voice of a character. We get characters speaking in different ways. We get other characters from the tale interacting with the story. So this is a very meta-narrative in many ways. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the Merchant's Tale within the Camp of Blue Tales. Now, you should be aware that just before this tale by the Merchant, the clerk, the student of Oxenford, the Oxford student, tells a courtly love story about a perfect marriage and a wife who is so devoted to her husband that she undergoes cruel challenges that that she demonstrates her loyalty right to the end, and she's rewarded with the love of her husband. Now, this infuriates this merchant, who then goes on to tell a story because he's so unhappy in his own marriage. And he tells a misogynistic story in reaction to that, and also in reaction to the wife of Bath story. Okay, so we should be aware of the context in which this story takes place. He tells a story about a corrupt knight. The knight on the pilgrimage also is the most important in terms of status. And so the knight's tale is the first tale told. And so in a way, this tale that this merchant tells about a knight could also be a little bit of a dig to the man of higher status in the Canterbury Tales. Because this is mimicking conversational speech, let me just see if you will often find lots of idiomatic phrases like God knows, God would, or Saint Marie, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, kind of appeals to the saints, are kind of conversational. And you will also see rhetorical techniques to persuade. Rhetoric is a subject in which people would argue and try and persuade other people to their way of thinking. And we see this being used. And so good students would be aware of how language is used in different ways. I'm going to use that. The final thing is the relationship between the teller and the tale. Now, this is really important. Some students go into the exam and they will talk solely about the tale, or they will talk solely about the prologue. The question you're being asked is on the merchant's prologue and tale. And so you need to be aware of the relationship between them. This merchant tells a story which is full of cynicism because he's in a cynical, he's in a failed marriage, and he's misogynistic about women. There will be deliberate parallels in the language that you see later on in the tale. And so there's a kind of humorous kind of connection, a little bit like a stand-up comic might sow the seed of one phrase and then they bring it back at the end for the punchline. And as I said previously, this tale mirrors other tales or parodies other tales or reacts against other tales. So you should have an awareness of the wife of Bath and the clerk's tale, these tales from the marriage group, which also includes the Franklin's tale. You don't need to have a detailed knowledge of them, but you have to see that there are 4 tales that make a commentary about marriage. Okay, these are some of the themes that are touched upon in the prologue and the tale. You can have a look at those, and I'm recording this, so I'm not going to read everything out from every PowerPoint. So I'm going to open something else now. So now I'm going to go into the line summaries, if I can. Now everything. Now I've just got your faces. Excuse me a minute. I've done something and now all I have are your faces. So conversation. Okay, can you see this PowerPoint now? If somebody could type yes or no. Yes, excellent. Right, so let's just see what that PowerPoint is. Okay, I'm sorry I can't hear you. Can I hear you? Right, let's see if, are any of you able to, let's see if I can unmute your, Hannah, can you hear me? Okay. Yes. Has anyone got any questions they want to type at this stage? I can't actually get your voices. So if you can kind of write down some questions. So you can all see the PowerPoint that I've got on screen. Right, let's go through the tale. Weapon and a wailing, care another soreway. This is how the merchant sums up marriage. Okay, so he's challenged by, he's unhappy. You should know that he says his wife would overmatch the devil. She is a shrew, which is a small furry animal. You might remember Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. And he says there is a long difference, line 11, between Gracildus, his great patience, and my wife. So then the host tells him, all right then, you've got a cynical view of marriage, tell us a story. And he tells us a story about a knight. And this knight is a worthy knight, line 34, but this knight isn't worthy at all. He comes from Pavia, I think it is, a city in Lombardy, which is supposed to be a city renowned for prostitution. And this man has lived his life in a secular life. But for one day on line 41, the merchant tells us, were it for holiness or for doubtage, for madness or for holiness, he decides to take a wife. So in that, you can see the attitude of the merchant. He's cynical about anyone he should want to marry because he's so deeply unhappy. So we should always see that irony running through the tale. Okay. What else would be important here? And certainly as sooth as God is king, as true as God is king, to take a wife is a glorious thing, line 55. You might think, well, hold on a second. The merchant seems to be contradicting himself. No other life, he said, is worth a being, for wedlock is so easy and so clean, that in this world it is a paradise, line 53. Thus said this old knight that was so wise. One of the things you've got to just get a handle on is when is the merchant speaking and when is the knight speaking. And I think on line 50 to line 55, that's really ironic because this is the language of the knight, January. He says, wedlock is so easy and so clean. It's so easy, it's such a lovely life, and it's so clean, it's spiritually clean. No other life is worth a being. That phrase comes up later. And then in this world, it's a paradise. Thus said this old knight that was so wise. So the merchant tells us how wise this knight is, but we know it's complete and utter irony. The merchant thinks he's an idiot. Okay, so let's move on. I'm just conscious that you can see. You can still see that PowerPoint. I'm just toggling through. Can someone say yes or no? Still see the PowerPoint? Yep. Yeah, okay, great. Okay. Now, lines 65 to 180. I'm going to summarize this very quickly. Here the merchant is extolling the virtues of being married. And he's saying, he's talking ironically, the merchant is now going to make a list of reasons as to why people should all marry. So he's already contradicting himself, but he's doing it ironically. Okay, you just need to have his arguments. Well, what are his arguments for why should a man marry? And these are, well, obviously to produce an heir, Property is important. A wife is the ultimate piece of property. That's interesting. The attitude to women is always going to be an interesting question that comes up in the exam. They're going to give you 5, 6 questions. Both texts are to do with women. All of the text combinations that the different schools and colleges could choose are kind of have strong women roles. So there's always going to be a question about the presentation of women. So the reasons he gives: a wife is an ultimate servant. You know, slavery is justified in the Bible. A wife will fulfill physical desires, be loyal, is a gift from God. Marriage is a holy sacrament, and a wife will look after you in old age. Well, these may be valid reasons that a man should marry, but we know early on that the merchant is being ironic. He doesn't really mean this. And he tells the listeners, defy Theophrastus. Don't listen to Theophrastus, who says men should never marry. Well, what does Theophrastus say? He says on line 83, Theophrastus says, never take no wife, for husbandry as for to spare in household thy dispense. A true servant doeth more diligence, thy good to keep than thine own wife. So to summarize on line 80 then, Theophrastus says, don't take a wife. A servant will be better for you than ever having a wife. The merchant has obviously read Theophrastus and regrets his decision. So he's being ironic, okay? Now, the bottom line talks on line 94 on page 19. If thou take a wife unto thine hold, full lightly mightst thou be a cuckold. Now, cuckold is a word that puts fear into the god of men in the medieval ages. And men are obsessed about being cuckolds, the idea that they are going to have wives who are going to play away. And so this comes through in literature all the time. And this is what Theophrastus says. You get married, your wife will betray you. Okay? And he says, it's hard for a young man to keep a wife, never mind an old man. You shouldn't do that. That's said later on. Okay. So the merchant gives many examples from the Bible of good wives. Rebecca, Judith, Abigail, and Esther. All are good wives, but, and this is where the irony is, you should know it. You don't need to know all of these individual stories for the purpose of the exam. But what you do need to know is that Rebecca, Judith, Abigail, and Esther are good wives, but in a way in which they all, one way or another, deceive their husbands. So what we're looking at here is ironic foreshadowing of the initial deception that happens in the tale. Okay? So the merchant, like a good stand-up comedian, is setting up what happens in the tale through irony. Okay, I've got 20 minutes. Right. So now I jump to line 88, I think. So for all of that, the merchant gives us an ironic argument as to why marriage is convenient from the man's point of view, and that all women will be helpful, just like Esther and Rebecca, and all the examples or biblical authorities that he gives us. So my advice to you is you don't need to know every single story about them, but how those biblical authorities are being used. Biblical references or allusions are being used. Right. So line 188, we start to get into, we're back to the story of January, and he's decided to get married. And he has 2 friends. And he's decided that he will have a woman of 195, fair and tender of age. Tender as well is an ironic description. There's lots of descriptions of young women as young animals or as meat that you should be aware of on line 188. So he says, I want to marry. I want someone who, on line 205, does not pass 20 years. And let's look at some of the language he uses to describe women that he doesn't want. He doesn't want old fish and young flesh. He regards himself as old fish, and young flesh would I have full fame. Better to have a pike than a pickerel, right? So, and better than old beef is the tender veal. So again, it's about youth that he wants. He doesn't want any woman of 30 years. They are dry as bean straw and great forage. So he doesn't want an old widow. Line 21:9. God knows, that means, they can as much craft on waves of boot, so much broken. The sundry skulls make subtle clerks. So he says the fact that old widows might have lived with many scholars would make them in some way wise as well. So he doesn't want anyone intelligent either. If I was to look at that page, he wants someone who may be warm with wax on line 218. He wants someone that he can mold. Okay. Now, wax becomes important in the tale later on. So, like a warm candle, he wants to mold her. But this knight has a problem. He wants someone who will live full holily and be chaste and loyal to him, and who will give up her debt and pay her marital debt. But he's worried that he will have his heaven on earth. And to religious people, if they have heaven on earth, they're worried that they won't have heaven in the afterlife. And we come back to that discussion a little later. On page 31, forgive me if I'm going fast, I'm aware of the time. We have a whole paragraph in which January tells us how fit he is, how strong he is. He compares himself to a tree in full blossom. Again, this is irony of self. He says his limbs are as green as laurel, so he's evergreen. He never ages. Now, the irony is we're laughing at someone who's completely detached from their real selves. Okay. So I think on page 31, just the awareness of the irony of self here is important. Now, the next section is January asks the advice of his two friends, Placebo and Justinus. He explains why he wants to marry and what he's looking for. And you just need to have an awareness of how Placebo tells him everything he wants to know. Just like a placebo is a tablet that doesn't do anything, Placebo, the character, doesn't really give him any advice. He says, you know, a true servant would be stupid to think that they were wiser than their master. So that's all you need to know about Placebo. But Justinus has some interesting ideas, and we'll look at those. So let's turn to let's see if you've got any questions first of all. I'll turn over the page back to you. Are there any questions at this stage? Am I going too fast for people? Is there something I haven't explained? Got to try and get to 51 and next. Should be hard. So we can jump through placebo. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Justinus says, because I think Justinus takes up this idea of what January is looking for. On lines 320, this is what January says. I warn you well, it's no child's play to take a wife without advisements. Justinus says, I'm giving you a warning. Don't do it. Hearkeneth what I say. Listen to me. Line 310. And he gives a list of reasons why you shouldn't marry. And you can maybe quote the odd word. Don't go into the exam thinking you have to quote whole lines. I always tell students, quote individual words. He says, women, whether she be wise or sober or drunken well, or proud, or else otherwise a shrew, there's that word again, a chidester, a trickster, or waster of thy good, rich or poor, or else mannish wood, mental, albeit so that no man find and shall, none in this world, that trotteth whole in all. So, whole in all. There will be no such thing as a perfect woman in this world. So he's trying to give him advice, but this is also perhaps the voice of the merchant, the cynical view of women. Turn to page 37. For God knows I have wept many a tear full privately since I have had a wife. Justinus, like the merchant, has been married and regrets it.
Yeah, I got a text from the surgery for that clinic. Right? It's not 20.
Okay. I think someone.
But I got a text from the surgery, you know, the injection that they're doing at that hand over thing. Oh, yeah. So they sent it. It is from.
Okay. Sorry, I've had to mute someone there. Why does January want to marry again? January doesn't want to marry again. He's never been married. He's lived a life of perfect secular life in which he's exercised his bodily delights. Why does January want to marry though? Because he's worried that having all this sexual pleasure, he won't go to heaven. But he also wants to get married because he's guaranteeing sex from his wife. It is so easy and so clean. Okay, remember the quote, easy, E-S-Y, and clean. Clean, spiritually clean, and easy, it's so easy for him. He's going to have sex on tap, and he's also going to go to heaven because marriage is a sacrament. So he's using marriage selfishly for his own desires. And as a result, he's going to be punished for it. So that's why he wants to marry. But thanks for the question. So, on page 37, there's kind of like a cynical, misogynistic argument as to why men shouldn't ever marry. He says, Justinus says, I've been married, I weep all the time. And people think neighbours think my wife is lovely. Namely, if you take a young wife fair and fair, 3, 4, 5, the youngest man that is in all this route is busy enough to bring it about to have his wife alone. So Justinus says, women will stray. So it's quite a misogynistic view of women. And he says, if you think you're going to get your marital debt, i.e. have sex from your wife, she's going to pay her debt, she will pay you back. And that's the end of that paragraph. So it's all about the distrust of women. And you get that in your next text, so it might be worth quoting what Justinus says. But being a fool, January doesn't believe him. And then he decides to just go ahead and do it regardless. Now, January takes his mirror to the marketplace to spy on suitable third estate women. Okay, it's interesting that it's a marketplace. This is a woman that is being purchased, and the merchant in his descriptions is saying that. She's in the marketplace. He looks at loads of women. None of them seem quite right. They all have a flaw. Okay? And the end of the page on page 39 is always something worth quoting. And it becomes important later on in the tale. For love is blind all day and may not see. January is blind to his own age. And January is blind to the foolishness of getting married. And that's really important. Okay, let's move on. These are some words that January is used to describe women: old flesh, young flesh, pike, tender veal, doesn't want old beef. So he's very much thinking about the physicalized pleasure of young women and that they can be manipulated by warm wax. Now, January selects May, but faces a spiritual problem, right, on lines 387 to 414. He thinks about her beauty, he sexualizes her, he fantasizes about her. And it's the merchant who says love is blind and may not see. And the merchant could be talking about himself. Now, January worries he won't be able to enter heaven if he has marriage, if he has heaven on earth. And the idea of a rich man not being able to go to heaven is real. And placebo tells him you can have two types of bliss, earthly and heavenly. And he makes reference to the wife of Bath and her story. Okay, but what I think is quite interesting is, let's see if I can put it written down here. These are some of the things that January sees in May: kindness, fantasy, respectability, virginity. But again, he's blind, so does he really see these things, or is he just seeing her beauty and her young age? How does he know that she's wise? He's not heard her say anything. He's blind to this. I want to just look at what Justinus says on page 45. Justinus, as a true friend, hated his folly. He hated the stupidity of January. And he answered right in his japery. For he would his long tail abread, and would none authority allege. And he says this, on lines 450, ye may repent of wedded man's life, in which you saying there is no woe nor strife. He's saying, you're going to repent of this, and else, God forbid that he send a wedded man him grace to repent, well oft rather than a single man. So he says, married men repent and regret more than single men. And he says, rather than you losing the thought of going to heaven because you're going to have heaven in marriage, he says on lines 4, 5, 8, she may be your purgatory. So he's saying to January, your wife may be your hell on earth. She may be God's whip. And she's going to punish you so much on line 460 that your soul will up to heaven skip. So again, the lines are highlighting what's going to happen. So the foolishness of January is that he's not going into this without advice. Okay, let's consider the settlement. Now, the thing to look out for with the arrangement for the wedding is how January chooses his bride. And I think the words that you want to look for, and this is on page 447, is start the new paragraph. Justin and his brother, this maiden which thy mate, as hastily as ever that she might, shall wedded unto this January be. If I told you of every scrip and bond, on line 485, scrip and bond are kind of legal documents for the purchase of land or property. So she is fifed in his land. So the merchant is describing this in terms of a transaction of goods, which I think is ironic. The emphasis is on how this is not a romance or of any love, but it's a transaction. And as a result, we want to see January punished for this. Okay, I'm going to rush through the rest now. The next page describes on page 49 this splendid ceremony of the marriage. Okay, and this is probably the most descriptive part of the whole tale. And we have this wedded with such solemnity, and that there's never been such a beautiful wedding. Orpheus of the underworld never saw such a beautiful wedding, or Thebes in antiquity, in Greek times, never saw such a beautiful wedding. Nobody in all of times has ever seen anything as beautiful. Venus laughed upon the whole event. Now, this is all deeply ironic. The splendid description of the ceremony in the elaborate language is completely ironic. While it might be a convention in courtly love stories to describe marriages this way, in this case, it's ironic. We don't really believe that this marriage is, or this wedding is wonderful, and that is one of the best weddings ever seen. And so all these ornate references to classical Greek allusions are really just to heighten the ironic description. You don't need to know all the background to all these names or what their stories are, only to see how it built up in such an ironic, over-exaggerated way. And it's really to highlight how preposterous this wedding actually is. Okay. Now, the funny thing that punctuates this is perhaps the last page, is that January, he can't wait to get this over. He's so infatuated by May on page 50 that he has violent fantasies about her. He wants to ravish her on line 538. January is ravished in a trance every time he looks on her face. All he can think about is getting this wedding ceremony over so he can jump into bed with her. But he's so worried that his passion is going to be so strong that on line 540, he's going to menace her. And his arms are going to be too strong for her, harder than Paris did Helene. So he thinks he's going to be too powerful for her. Again, the description is comically ironic. January thinks he's this overwhelming lover that is going to be too powerful for this young woman, and he's going to hurt her. So there's a kind of irony of self. And he thought, alas, so tender creature, now would God give you the strength to endure all my courage. It is so sharp and so keen. So on line 547, he describes his courage. And what he means there is a euphemism for his sexual desire. He desires himself. He says that he is so sharp and keen that she might not be able to withstand his lovemaking, which we're supposed to laugh at because he's so absurd. Okay, so that takes us up to the end of the marriage. I just have time to answer any questions from any of you that would like to ask me any questions. If you put your hand up, I think I can. You can talk, or if that doesn't work, you just type. Does anyone want to ask a question? Okay. Does anyone not want to type? If anyone wants to type anything, you can stay on and I'll answer. Okay, forgive me for going through that quite fast. Don't feel that you have to understand every word, but getting the broad gist of it is what you're expected to do. I hope I've stressed that the importance in this early section is the ironic persona of Chaucer writing as a failed husband, the merchant, who hates marriage, possibly hates women, certainly hates his wife, who he thinks would overmatch the devil. And I think the irony in the description of this worthy knight isn't worthy at all. And also the irony in the irony of self of the January himself, this old man who thinks he's really cool, which I suppose is the danger that all middle-aged men have, that they go into middle age still thinking they are young men. And that's something that perhaps is ripe for us to laugh at. And this is a tale and a prologue in which we are meant to laugh at it and the characters within it. Okay, that takes me over to 5 o'clock, which is over the time. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found that useful. I will send a link to the recording of this if you're okay with that. And if I could have some feedback from you, it would be quite good to see whether we do things like this in the future. If we go into lockdown, I probably will be doing whole cohort ones. And if there's any ways in which we can improve it, please give me some feedback. That would be great. Have a nice day, everyone. Take care. Bye. Thank you. You're welcome. What actions?